On the 24th of May 2008, 18-year-old Rob Knox was out celebrating. He had not long finished filming for Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, where he played the role of Marcus Belby. Landing that role was a huge break for Rob, who was clearly destined for great things, including appearing in the future Harry Potter film Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Unfortunately, the defendant was also out that night. After Jamie, Rob's brother, was threatened with a knife by the defendant, Rob stepped in as the protective older brother. As he and his friends attempted to disarm the defendant, Rob was stabbed 5 times. You see, unbeknownst to the group, the defendant had in fact been carrying 2 kitchen knives. 5 of Rob's friends also suffered serious injuries resulting from the confrontation. Despite the best efforts of paramedics and hospital staff, Rob ultimately lost his life that night. Hey everybody, and welcome to this special episode of the Students' Verdict podcast. To all of you new listeners, hi, my name's Emily and I'm your host. Today we're going to be doing things a little bit differently. So it all started with one man, Aaron Truss, a close friend of Rob's who has just finished directing a documentary about Rob's life and knife crime. It's called Knox, the Rob Knox Story. This documentary is going to be released soon, and let me tell you, you are not going to want to miss it. It's such a beautiful tribute to Rob that will have you feeling every emotion under the sun. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Well, I'm very excited to tell you that myself, Chantel of Lady Justice podcast, and Steve of True Crime Fix podcast are collaborating to bring you, the listeners, the story of Rob Knox. True Crime Fix will tell you all about Rob and his life. You'll be hearing from Colin, Rob's dad, and some of Rob's close friends and family. Lady Justice podcast will tell you all about the night that Rob died and the media attention around his case. Please listen to both these episodes before you start this one. In this episode, I'll be talking about the trial and the aftermath. As I've said, to really get to know Rob Knox and his story, please make sure you listen to all 3 episodes. I've included all the important links in the show notes, so please go and check them out. A huge thank you to everyone who has helped us by doing interviews or providing us with the material we needed. That includes the band Taxi Joe, who very kindly provided us with the original music scores. With all of that said, let's jump into today's episode, which is dedicated to Rob Knox and the family and friends who miss him every day. There were 45,627 offences involving knives or sharp instruments recorded by police in 2019, a 7% rise on year and 49% higher than 2011 when comparable records began, the Office for National Statistics said. Rob's story is, unfortunately, just one of many. I had the honour of speaking with a number of special guests for today's episode. These include Rob's father, Colin Knox, former Detective Chief Inspector Damien Allain, Director Aaron Truss, and Executive Producer Joe Akers. The first person we're going to hear from is former DCI Damien Allain. Can you please introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about you and your work?
Okay, so my name's Damien Allain. I retired from the Met about 3 years ago now. as a detective superintendent within Trident, dealing with gang and gun crime. And prior to that, a vast amount of my experience was dealing with homicide and leading homicide investigations. And my current role is as a self-employed criminal justice consultant, and I also do some work with an organisation called Inside Justice, which looks at and investigates miscarriages of justice.
And you were involved with Rob Knox's case. As I've already explained, we will not be saying the name of the defendant in this case. We will just be referring to them as the defendant. Okay. Can you recall what the defendant was charged with? And can you explain those charges in layman's terms?
So the charges, there were a number of charges. Well, obviously the main charge was murder. Murder is obviously probably the most serious offence that you could commit. And, murder is basically an intent to kill or cause somebody really serious harm, and death results. So it requires a degree of intent. There were other charges in relation to other victims of that assault. So there was grievous bodily harm with intent, and there was wounding with intent. And again, obviously death hadn't resulted in those circumstances, but both those charges, GBH with intent and wounding with intent, are serious charges, typically associated with serious assaults involving weapons, whether that be a knife or a gun or some sort of implement where serious injury results.
This case must have been difficult, or any case of this nature must be really difficult when you've lost a life. Obviously, in this case, it was Rob's. And as you say, a lot of people got injured at the same time. So it must have been a very trying case for everyone. How did the defendant come across to you during the course of both the investigation and during the trial?
Well, if I might just talk about the difficulties of the case, because the difficulties of the case, to some extent, were compounded by the fact that obviously this offence had occurred in a busy bar come nightclub. There was a lot of confusion. Clearly, Rob had been stabbed, had a number of his friends. So, it was quite a confusing scene for first responders. And in terms of investigating that type of offence, it's really important to try and secure and preserve, forensic evidence, identify witnesses, identify suspects. And sometimes those sorts of actions can become very difficult, given the amount of people that have been injured, the confusion. There would have been lots of people panicking within that bar who weren't necessarily injured, but they'd witnessed things happening. And people obviously had left the scene as well before police had arrived. So, it's about obtaining witness evidence as well,
Yeah, where do you even, I know it sounds silly, when you pull up to a scene like that, as you say, you have got people everywhere. You've got people who are sort of more of a help, maybe some who are not through any fault of their own, but are more of a hindrance. Where do you start?
Well, first responding police officers, a core sort of skill, if you like, of a police officer should be good communication. And most experienced officers are versed with dealing with people who are distressed, who are injured, angry. It's really about taking command of that scene. So, hopefully there would have been a sergeant or inspector who'd arrived. But even, if it was a young PC, they also demonstrate leadership skills. So it's about taking command of the situation, identifying what the priorities are. And, really the priorities are in those circumstances. First steps at a scene of a crime is preservation of life. And clearly there's lots of people injured there. So that has to take priority. And making sure that sufficient resources have been requested to attend the scene, whether that's police or the ambulance service. And once that's in hand, it really is then about, well, how do I preserve the evidence? Where do I put the cordons? Because you can have more than one scene. There might be a scene of a crime where an injured party has left that scene, gone somewhere else, but there's blood at another location. So that then becomes another scene. So you can imagine in these circumstances there were a lot of victims of knife crime, lots of confusion, lots of panic, and lots to take in. But often police officers act in that sort of crisis role, and it's really just about stepping back and considering what the priorities are, and trying to deal with the public in the best way that you can.
I would imagine in a case such as this, where you know that you've got a number of people who are injured, meaning there is an attacker of some description out there, the time element, it's really not on your side.
Yeah, I mean, it's about threat, risk, and harm, really. Somebody that's committed an attack of that nature, clearly needs to be identified and arrested very quickly. And it's my recollection in this case that the defendant was arrested, very quickly after the incident, because it became very clear who it was. So the complicating factor wasn't necessarily who it was, but it is, still about because it might be obvious to a member of the public or the public in general that somebody's been named. You arrest somebody and then you put them before the court. Well, it's a whole lot more complex than that, because as in this circumstance, pleaded not guilty, and it's the prosecution's case to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt, and that involves gathering evidence. So it's not just about identifying the individual, which is really important. It is about a structured process, making the best use of your resources to retrieve the most evidence that you can, whether that's from witnesses or forensic evidence or CCTV or whatever it might be, But clearly one of the most important things is to remove the risk, and that was really important on the night, given that the defendant in this case was armed with 2 knives. And not only that, he'd had a dispute that evening, he'd left the club, gone home to retrieve the knives, and then come back. So really demonstrating an extreme level of intent, because despite having had this altercation in the bar earlier on, one might have assumed he could have left the bar and had a cooling down period and considered his position and just walked away. But no, he decided to walk home, which was a mile up the road, get 2 knives and then come back, which, as I say, it demonstrates quite a high level of intent.
I mean, I think that's, as you say, possibly the highest level of intent. You would think that, okay, heat of the moment, testosterone, I don't know, you get into a physical altercation and then you walk away, and you'd think that's the moment when you can make a decision and you can choose, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. And he obviously chose the wrong thing. How did the defendant in this case, come across to you? What did you make of him and his sort of behaviour?
Well, I mean, during the course of the investigation and the trial, the defendant came across as frankly quite arrogant, never ever demonstrated any element of resource or regret for his actions. And then, I mean, just going back really to the point you made about, the level of intent and how this occurred. What's tragic in these circumstances is often these murders happen in the heat of the moment, in a bar or a club, where people just, for whatever reason, lose control, and they either have a knife in their possession or they acquire a knife and use it. And you think, over what,
Yeah, absolutely.
Over nothing,
Yeah, as you say, I mean, it could have ended so differently. It didn't need to end the way it did, but whether it's fueled by, I don't know, alcohol, drugs, you don't know. In every circumstance it's different. But to go home and get 2 knives, you're going back there with an intent. Can you recall the defendant's previous convictions? Because these were quite shocking, I think, at the time of the trial.
Yeah, I mean, he'd had previous convictions for knife crime and a previous stabbing incident, is my recollection. I can't recollect the exact details, but suffice it to say, had had knife crime offences, previous convictions for using a knife, and at the time of his arrest, he'd been on bail. He was on bail, police bail, having been arrested in possession of a knife on a bus. So, in addition to that sort of level of intent demonstrated on the the level of intent demonstrated on the night, it was another pattern of behaviour that had been demonstrated previously.
Now, I've read this in a newspaper report. So, going back to what you said about him being on police bail, it was he was under investigation for a knife offence when he stabbed Rob. Now, I understand from this newspaper, not sure how accurate it is, that the Met disciplined 2 officers and changed its procedure as a result of this case. Do you know what went wrong and how the procedure was changed?
Well, my recollection is, in terms of what went wrong, there was a view that why was somebody who had demonstrated this level of previous offending in relation to knives, why was that individual, having been arrested on a bus in possession of a knife, why was he bailed pending further inquiries when conceivably perhaps he could have been charged? And if he'd been charged, perhaps he may have been in custody, I don't know, or there may have been some other restrictions if he'd been charged and been on bail. But the position was he wasn't charged, he wasn't under any form of restriction. So I guess the argument was, could the actions in relation to that offence on the bus, if something different had happened in relation to that, may that have prevented what had happened to Rob on the night that it did and his friends. Now, I don't recall that any officers lost their jobs over it, and I can't honestly recollect officers being disciplined. But the point is this: I think, during my time during that period, I do recollect that in terms I mentioned the concept of threat, risk, and harm. Is certainly procedures became tighter in terms of analysing what the threat is in front of you. So often we get reports involving individuals who are suspects for offences where they have got perhaps a high level of previous offending, and depending on what that level of offending is, the type of offending it is, whether it's use of weapons or sex crimes or whatever it is, it's really about understanding what the potential risk is of them reoffending at any point. So actually there's an imperative, if there is that high level of risk, to deal with what's in front of you now rather than wait a period of time, because lots of these individuals, these dangerous offenders, are repeat offenders. So really the imperative is to deal with it now. So if you have got an issue in front of you or a potential offence where there's a suspect with previous offending history, perhaps it's as well to deal with it there and then, and perhaps dissipate the risk for any further offences taking place.
The defendant in this case, as you've said, he pleaded not guilty.
Yeah.
Which I was surprised at. I'm sure many people, from an outsider's point of view, the evidence looked quite overwhelming. Nevertheless, he pleaded not guilty. Are there any parts of the trial that stick in your mind?
I think, I mean, just turning on the first point you made, in terms of him pleading not guilty, my view was, I was confident in my own investigation and we'd secured sufficient evidence to put a good case before the court. Now, you can't always prejudge how a jury will interpret that evidence, but my view was it was a strong prosecution case. That doesn't often preclude defendants who are charged with very serious offences, often murder, despite the fact that there's a strong prosecution case. Often they will plead not guilty because the stakes are pretty high. you're convicted of murder, you're going to get a life sentence with a significant minimum term, often in sort of 20 plus years terms of imprisonment. So the stakes are high, so it's not unusual for defendants in these types of cases to plead not guilty, despite the fact there may be a significant amount of evidence against them.
And in this trial, I got the impression there was a lot of media attention. This whole case, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there was a significant amount of media attention because it was Rob, because of his fame with the Harry Potter film. But I guess my enduring memory of the trial is and sometimes you underestimate this, and you've got young, often, on the face of it, strong young men who were clearly quite traumatized at the prospect of giving evidence. They were frightened, they'd lost a friend. And sometimes you underestimate that, the impact that a trial can have on witnesses, and other victims, of course, because often, in this particular case, some of the witnesses were victims as well. And they were very traumatized. So it's easy, from my perspective, I spent a vast proportion of my time at court. It's important not to lose focus on the impact that court does have on victims and victims' families and witnesses, because often it's about reopening, because sometimes it's months or even a year plus down the line, and it takes them right back to the time that the offence occurred and potentially opening that level of trauma again.
I work in criminal defence, and I've found when I've been to court that the tension in a courtroom as well. I've never been involved in a murder case, so I can only imagine. But that level of tension in a courtroom, you're bringing, as you've said, you're bringing everybody back together again. The trauma that was experienced by, as you say, victims, witnesses, Rob's family, for example, and they have to be in a room with their attacker, their friend's killer, and potentially the defendant's family as well, all in one room. And the tension, sometimes you feel like you could cut it with a knife. And I can't imagine it,
Yeah, it's a really good point that you make, and the stakes are high for everyone. The victim's family, the defendant's family. From my perspective, there's a lot of pressure in terms of being the senior investigator. It was a high-profile case. Nevertheless, you've got to continue to work objectively and in the interests of justice to make sure that that the defendant still has a fair trial. And then when you look at miscarriages of justice that happened back in the 70s and 80s, one of the sort of primary factors associated with some of those miscarriages of justice were allegedly, the high level of media and public pressure upon police to achieve convictions. So you have to keep all these things in perspective and in check, and things have changed a lot since those days in any event. But nevertheless, there's a lot of pressure on everyone involved, counsel, solicitors, the defendants, the victims' families, and the defendants' families,
Absolutely. I'd like to talk about the defendant's line of defense. So, as we've said a couple of times, he pleaded not guilty. And in some articles, they've said that he claimed to have been acting in self-defense. It seems as though the defendant had got into a confrontation with Rob and his friends. I believe it was about a week before Rob died. That was the 16th of May, 2008.
Okay.
Can you tell me a bit more about that incident?
Well, I mean, my recollection, I can't recall the exact detail, but certainly it was part of our investigation there had been a previous altercation. But of course, in terms of him proffering this concept of self-defence, although he mentions the incident the week before, primarily it has to turn upon the facts of what occurred on the night of the murder itself. So if you think about that logically, so we've already spoken about the fact that there was another altercation that night. He'd been ejected from the bar. He then chooses to walk a mile to his home address, acquire 2 knives, and come back. I mean, in those circumstances, any suggestion on any view that self-defence is a viable runner as a good defence is probably it's probably not a viable argument, really. I mean, and this goes to the point I made earlier on in terms of the stakes are high. He's not going to plead guilty, so if he pleads not guilty, he's going to have to come up with some sort of defence, however weak or strong that may be. And in my view, is that his defence of self-defence was weak given his actions and the level of intent he demonstrated following that altercation on the night of Rob's murder.
Well, I also read that he claimed he was attacked by Rob and his friends and had simply been protecting himself, pulling the knives or a knife to try and scare people away. And that people, I think he sort of said they ran into the knife or something bizarre. But as you say, I suppose he has to say something. If you're going to plead not guilty, you have to say something, don't you? I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recollect this the account that he gave in terms of people lunging themselves at knives and all this type of thing, and it was just wholly unbelievable in my view.
Well, I think I don't even understand, but I suppose, as we've said, he had to say something, and he mentioned, or an article mentioned, that the defendant claimed to have been battered with a piece of wood. He said that as Rob and his friends ran at him, the knife was catching on them, but they kept running into him. Was that? I don't know. Did he suffer any injuries? I haven't read that he did.
Yeah, my recollection is I don't recall any major injuries that would have justified his suggestion of self-defense.
As you've said, he went home and he got the knives. He could, in that instance, if you've gone home, then you are out of danger, aren't you? In any event, so why not just stay at home? If you're sort of worried about your life or your safety, why didn't he just stay at home? So the defendant received a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years. The judge said, and this is just a snippet of a quote, he said that the defendant was a highly dangerous man who was a very significant risk to the public of serious harm. The judge went on to say that he didn't think it was proved that the defendant intended to kill Rob, but that he just didn't care whether he died or not. Did you think this was accurate, and do you think the sentence was sufficient?
Well, in terms of the judge's remarks about, did he intend to kill him, that may or may not be right. I mean, certainly if you use a knife, there's an intent to cause serious bodily harm, which of course is sufficient to convict you of murder if death results. In terms of the sentence, he received a minimum term of 20 years, which is a significant sentence. And I don't know, often victims' families will say, I want them banged up for the rest of their life, and the sentence wasn't enough. I mean, to a large extent, my role within the criminal justice process is to put the evidence before the court, and it's the judge's decision to, impose a prison sentence. Do I think it was sufficient? I mean, it's a lengthy term of imprisonment. It's a minimum term. And if he still poses a danger to society, it's not guaranteed that he will be released at that 20-year point. He could have. And I think my recollection is he, because he was under the age of 21, I think at that moment he was convicted of the offence, the sentence would have been mitigated in that regard. Had he been over 21, he may have received a higher minimum tariff. But it is a minimum term. There is no guarantee that he will be released at that 20-year point, and the element of dangerousness will be under close consideration when it comes to him applying for parole in due course, and he'll be on a life licence in any event, even if he is released. And one of the things they will look at is, obviously the nature of the offence that occurred, the fact that there were a number of previous convictions involving a knife, and whether he will, currently at the point that they're considering parole, whether he represents a continuing danger to society.
When the verdict came in and when the sentence was handed down, did the defendant show any signs of remorse?
No, he didn't throughout the whole process.
He sounds like quite a cold individual. Is that accurate?
I think he's variously been described as, well, many people have described him as being angry, and there was some sense that he'd undergone some form of anger management therapy at one stage.
When he was younger, yeah, I'd read that.
And he did strike me as being just quite an angry person, and just never demonstrated one, iota of remorse or compassion, right the way through the whole process, from his arrest right the way through to when he was convicted.
Even when he had Rob's family in court with him, there was just no remorse whatsoever.
No.
I find that shocking. But then, as you say, if he did those anger management courses when he's younger, if he's a very angry individual, it might be that's why he decided, I'm going to go home, get the knives and come back, where the reasonable person might have, just gone home. You don't know what goes on in someone's head, I suppose. No. Moving away from the trial a little bit, over the course of your career, did you see the statistics around knife crime change? And I suppose if you did see an increase in those cases, how did that affect you and your team?
Well, it was round about the time of Rob's murder that we'd started to see a significant increase in the level of knife crime and murders in the capital, in London. And, it did have an impact on our teams, because we became, like any resource, with more work, you become more stretched. But then in the years following Rob's murder, knife crime reduced quite significantly in London. But then but in recent times, in the recent sort of 4 or 5 years, it started to creep up again, and the murder rate's gone up again, which is not good.
No, absolutely. What do you think can be done to try and combat knife crime? Because I know it's particularly prevalent among young people.
I don't profess to hold all the answers, but it is a real complex debate. There are a number of factors. There was a view, and it's quite an old view, that it's down to the police. Well, it's an important part of what the police do in terms of enforcement, but this, police can't deal with this issue alone. It's an issue for society. I notice a lot of politicians throw around the term, turn it into a public health debate. But what does that actually mean? And that's a longer term strategy in terms of having a public health debate. But all the while you're aspiring to a wider strategy around prevention, you've still got to deal with what's in front of you, and you've got to enforce what's in front of you. Now, the reality is more people are carrying knives, and it's pretty much always been the case that you're as likely to be a suspect, or convicted of a knife crime as you are a victim of a knife crime. So, if you're carrying a knife for self-protection, and you encounter a violent incident, the chances are you're going to end up using that knife. But equally, if you carry a knife, you're as likely to become a victim of knife crime as well.
Indeed.
So it is a really complex debate. There's been a lot of controversy around the tactic of stop and search.
Yeah.
That decreased significantly over a period during. It was during the period of Theresa May as Home Secretary. And there was a big debate around, what is the success rate in terms of how many searches result in tangible results in terms of knives being recovered or drugs or whatever the commodity is that's being looked for. And as a consequence of that, a lot of officers were wary of discipline or being put under a microscope in relation to stop and search, and they lost confidence in it. And frankly, they stopped using the tactic. And my experience is that if you look at any sort of criminology, research around how criminals behave, they're opportunists, and if they see an opportunity, they'll take one and they'll modify their tactics. And certainly during my time at Trident, anecdotally, we were sort of receiving evidence that people felt empowered to be able to carry weapons because they knew that the cops weren't searching them. So, I can understand it, and quite rightly, it's important that if that tactic is used, it's used lawfully.
Of course.
And it's used in a way that sort of demonstrates confidence in the police. Now, often that's difficult because often some of the people you're searching are the types of individuals that maybe, they've got a beef with the police in any event because they've got previous convictions or whatever it might be. And often some of these, they can be confrontational on occasions, but nevertheless, it is important that the tactic that's used is lawful, it's proportionate, and there's reasonable grounds. And as much as possible, that the encounter leaves a positive outcome in terms of that human interaction.
Absolutely. Something that you said, that people believe it's down to the police. Now, in my head, if the police are having to take a knife off somebody, by that point it's already too late. I feel like it has to sort of start. Don't get me wrong, I don't have the answers. Absolutely don't have the answers. But to me, it should be that they're not carrying them in the first place. Wave a magic wand, maybe. But does that make sense? That it shouldn't be for the police to kind of clean up.
But the police have a role in terms of prevention and trying to deter people from becoming involved in knife crime. And indeed, they do engage in those types of activities. Some of the work I used to do at Trident was overseeing, prevention campaigns for knife crime. It's important as part of curriculum in schools. I think knife crime is dealt with, but as part of curriculums within education. But equally, it's about parental control. I think parents have got an important role.
Absolutely.
If you're, for me as a parent, if my 14-year-old daughter was found out in the street by the police at 11 o'clock at night in possession of a knife, well, that would cause me a lot of concern. Well, the first point is, well, what is she doing out at that time of night? Back school night, in possession of a knife. Now, some really good work's been done in Manchester, for instance, where that situation might occur, where a young person's been stopped in possession of a knife. It's viewed as this is a risk factor that we need to sit down with partners such as social services and get the parents involved and urgently do something about this and say, your child is at risk, because if they're carrying a knife, going back to the original point, they could equally be a victim of knife crime. So they're out the street at 11 o'clock at night, 2 o'clock in the morning, perhaps with another gang member or something. So it is about that rounded approach in terms of the risk to that child or that young person.
As you say, the risk of being either an attacker or a victim, generally speaking, I mean, it doesn't even bear thinking about if it's someone that you love, that you care about, if it's your child or your brother, your sister. Are there any final thoughts that you have that you'd like to share with those listening, whether it's about Rob or the trial or knife crime, anything at all?
Well, I think and I've talked about this before, but in terms of Rob's death, it sort of underscores, because of Rob's popularity and his notoriety, it sort of shone a light in terms of knife crime, and Colin and Sally, Rob's parents, really turned that into something positive with the Rob Knox Trust and all the work that they've done, in terms of anti-knife crime messages and what have you. But really, what it did for me, it underscored the fact that if it could happen to Rob, it could happen to anyone, but also that split second, it was a dispute in a bar, over nothing, and somebody's lost their life over it. Rob's lost his life over it, and it could happen to anyone. And just the impact as well in terms of, some young people who end up being convicted of murder, they've ruined their lives as well. They go to prison for a significant term. It's the impact on their family, and they'll be on life license for the rest of their lives. Now, lots of people say, "Well, I really don't care about that individual," but if you take a step back, it's the whole impact on society. Do we want to be in a position where we're banging up young people when, as you rightly point out, we should be focusing on prevention and stopping it happening in the first place? So I think it's a really important point from a societal perspective that we do more to deter knife crime, because young people, people do react when they've had a drink. They do lose their temper, and it can have tragic circumstances.
Yeah, and I think that's why the Rob's parents, they sort of are huge advocates against knife crime, and they go into schools, and I think that's why Rob's story is so important to tell, because as you say, Rob could have been anyone. Anybody can get into an argument in a bar. So I think that's a very sort of sobering point to end on. Damien, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I really, really appreciate it.
That's a pleasure, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you. My next interview is with Joe Akers, who is one of the executive producers of Knox, the Rob Knox story. He is also one of the incredible musicians who makes up Taxi Joe, who created the song you heard at the beginning. I'd like to welcome to the show today's special guest, Joe Akers. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
So, Joe, can you please introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about you?
Okay, so my name's Joe. I'm involved in. I produced the documentary with Aaron and Colin. I also with two other guys who I'm in a band with wrote and recorded the soundtrack. So that's kind of doubly fun for me. But it's been a kind of my experience of this whole thing is having known Rob myself. I mean, we met same year he died, so we weren't super close, but we had some great times together in the time that we did know each other. And we made a short zombie movie because Aaron and I have been making movies since we were very, very young, and this is kind of just another one of those things that we do, But this has been it's been a love job, this film. I'm kind of personally I do lots of different things in terms of art, like writing and music and films and just sort of everything really. And this is my first documentary actually, so I've really enjoyed kind of going down that rabbit hole, and discovering.
Yeah. Particularly, I suppose, because you've got that that personal connection as well.
Yeah.
I think that's what's lovely about this documentary, is that the amount of people involved, family, friends, there's such a personal touch on it. I suppose that's how you got involved in this project then, is through knowing Rob and the family.
Yeah. So yeah, we, as I say, we'd made a cheesy zombie flick when we were younger, and like shortly after we finished making the film is when he passed, and it threw us all, because we were only, I think I was 20, so I was a couple of years older than the others, but just the idea that someone so young that was in your friendship group could just disappear like that, it blew us all apart. And through the years, when the family set up the Rob Knox Foundation, they kind of did various different things. Obviously, they made the Cold Kiss, the knife crime awareness movie with Ray Winston, which I was also in, and they've done the Rob Knox Film Festival, which I've played at a couple of times actually, and had a couple of films entered into, which was also very good. So yeah, it's been kind of like we've been involved on that kind of level for a while.
That's nice though. Again, I think that personal touch radiates through the documentary. And speaking of which, what can you tell us about the Rob Knox documentary?
The documentary itself I think it's quite special in terms of true crime, because, as you say, there is the fact that we were all friends, and it was made by friends and family of Rob. So a large percentage of the production team were people that knew him, and so there is this essence of, you were saying earlier, that you get to know Rob and you can feel Rob in there, which was something we were really aware of. And I think a lot of documentaries, true crime documentaries, tend to focus more on the defendant and the actual crime itself.
So true. So true.
And it's all about how did they do it, or what kind of person would do this. And we've kind of taken a different route because of it was Rob, and he was such a fantastic human being. And I don't just say this lightly, he was really special to know. And we kind of wanted to show someone's died here, and
yeah,
and the impact that it had on the family and his friends and everything, and all of us, and the fact that 12 years later we're still talking about him is huge.
It is. And it was being fortunate enough to have been able to preview the documentary early. I obviously didn't know Rob on a personal level, and yet you did feel this connection. So there's various footage, old footage, for example, and you found yourself laughing along. You found yourself just having such a great time, and as if you were a friend. And yet, obviously, then it sort of turns to this tragedy. And obviously, the other important part of the documentary was talking about the impact of knife crime on society.
Yeah.
I thought it was amazing. And one of the aspects of the documentary that is quite hard hitting is the trial aspect. Now, I know you weren't at the trial,
No.
but what can you tell us, having sort of seen it through the documentary and interviewed various people?
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the defendant's trial?
So yeah, as you say, I wasn't there, but we interviewed a lot of people and got their account of it. So we kind of got like an overview of piecing together what happened, because the same thing happened with the night he died. There was lots of different stories. So with regards to the trial, what it seemed to be, there was this sense throughout, Rob's family and friends, that even though the defendant was caught there with the knives, and he had a bar full of people that saw him do the deed, there was this sense that he might still get away with it. And there was that kind of sense that it was kind of edge of your seat, that they didn't want to believe that it was a done deal, even though they all knew, because they saw it. They were all there, and other people saw it, and they were, and you would think he sort of banged to rights, but then he goes and pleads not guilty, throws everything up in the air, and and starts. The defense were saying things like, he was acting in self-defense, and he was surrounded, and he was they were trying to paint this picture that Rob and his friends were some sort of gang that were ganging up on him. So the sense that the family kind of the whole story of the trial is kind of told through this sense of resentment that there was even a trial to begin with, because it seemed so obvious he's guilty. Why are we even doing this?
Yeah, and I've having worked in the legal sector, I know that a lot of families, victims, until that verdict comes in, you can be 99% sure that it's going to be a guilty verdict. But until that verdict actually comes in, sometimes you get cases where it's a complete curveball. And actually, to plead guilty, judges very much value if you plead guilty, because you save the victim or the victim's family from having to go through and experience what can be a very traumatic trial. So you can be, I work in criminal defense. I know that both prosecution and defense they can get quite nasty, because that's their job. But as a witness, I know that some of the witnesses in the defendant's case, who were witnesses for the prosecution, had a really tough time. And I think that was discussed in the documentary, that they actually had quite a traumatic time having to relive those events, even in interviews just with you guys making the documentary. It came across really hard.
There was one day in particular that I remember, and that was interviewing Jamie Knox, Rob's brother, and Nick Jones was a friend. He was there on the night, and he actually got stabbed himself. And I think you're interviewing Nick as well, aren't you?
Yes, I will be.
So the day we interviewed both of those was really hard for all of us. So it was the four of us. It was Jamie and Nick and Aaron and I, and we were. It was just tears. Everyone was just in tears, because it was just so tragic, and it was just bringing everything up again, But the sense that these young guys, they're 18. In fact, I think Jamie was even younger, and they were still kids. Yeah. And they sat there, and they thought they were just going in to tell their story, and then they're getting pulled apart by the defense, which is, as you say, their job. But these are kids; they're not prepared.
No.
And especially since the tack that the defense had decided to take, with they closed in on him and he was cornered, and it was complete fantasy, because he walked 2 miles home, picked up the knives, and walked 2 miles back. And he'd actually been heard saying a week before, "I'm going to come back here and someone's going to die." So there was some really chilling kind of details read out in the trial, and these young guys are telling their story, and being pulled apart and kind of accused of, in some way, being responsible for Rob's death, and they were living with that guilt already.
In some respect, so I really, really want people to watch the documentary because, as we say, they do talk about having to go through this trial. And I think I can imagine what that trial looked like. So for the listeners who don't know, the burden of proof is obviously on the prosecution in any criminal case. They have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
However, if a defendant then argues self-defense, they claim self-defense, then the burden of proof shifts. So it is then on the defense to prove self-defense. And so I can actually imagine how that line of questioning must have gone. And I imagine it was absolutely brutal, as you say, for young people who just thought, because when you go to the police, the police will ask you questions, you tell your story. You're not, no one questions your story at the police station. In the trial, however, you think, oh, I'm just going to go tell my story like I did in the police station. Unfortunately, it's just not like that. And so I can imagine how traumatic that must have been.
Yeah,
for them.
Jamie actually says that in the doc. He says, "I just thought I was making a statement. I didn't realise they were going to try and pick me apart." And there's a point at which, because there's a point earlier on in the night where the defendant is holding a knife up to his neck, and Jamie's in the car with another of their friends, and the car sort of pulls up a bit closer towards the curb, to just sort of see how Nick is, to get a bit closer, basically. And the defense lawyer kept saying towards the defendant, you drove towards the defendant, trying to make out that they were trying to run him over. Yeah, which wasn't the case.
I think it was, as you say, it was not the evidence against the defendant in this case was stacked against him. And to me, this is an attempt, it's a clutching at straws type case where maybe the defendant, when I spoke to DCI Elaine, he said that sometimes because these guys in these circumstances know they have so much to lose, they're looking at life in prison, they just try their luck anyway. And I think that's probably what this was. But I don't want to end talking about the defendant in this case. I want to talk about something a lot more positive, which has come out of something quite tragic. What can you tell us about the Rob Knox Foundation?
Okay, that's good. Yeah, the Rob Knox Foundation is fantastic. It's a nice change of pace, because the foundation itself is fantastic, and it's such a great legacy for Rob, because they've worked with prisoners and young people to kind of try and put a stop to knife violence in the UK, and this is kind of, I guess, part of that. But then there's the other side where they kind of try and, because it's one thing to say stop stabbing each other, but at the same time, right, but you have to do something else, give people another path. Show people that there's another way, and the Rob Knox Foundation does that. It gives opportunities to young people to get involved in the arts, particularly in film and TV and stuff. So they've got the academy where they teach young people how to use film equipment and cut together things and make their own movies. They've got the film festival, which actually they've got. I don't know the numbers. Multiple countries across the world, people were sending in their offerings from all over the world, and they get involved in the community, and give young people a shot, which I think is just fantastic, because that's what Rob was all about. He was all about going for opportunities. And he got his first couple of TV jobs himself when he was he was a young kid, and he would write to TV companies and stuff, and so it kind of carries that on and enabling other young children or young people, teenagers and stuff, to figure that out for themselves. And it has actually produced some good industry professionals. So I can't talk highly enough of the Rob Knox Foundation. It's such a fantastic thing to be a part of and to watch.
I love that Rob's passion, as you say, he managed to get those jobs himself, which is just incredible. And in the documentary, you get to see a couple of scenes, some samples of his work, most notably obviously being Harry Potter. And I love that out of something tragic, something awful, his family and friends have been able to create something that Rob was absolutely passionate about as well. But they've been able to create something so that hopefully these young people won't fall victim like Rob did. They can channel their energy into something amazing rather than, being out and hopefully not getting involved in any knife crime. They can be channeling their energy into something amazing. Yeah. And you never know, they might get their break like Rob did through the film festival. You just, you just don't know with these things. But I just think it's amazing that a family and friends, rather than wallowing in grief, which I'm sure they feel that loss every day, every minute of the day.
Yeah.
And yet, rather than, you see it when Colin in the documentary, talks about Rob, you feel that loss, and yet rather than wallowing in it, they've created something amazing. And I think it's incredible.
You hit the nail on the head there. I feel like the pain hasn't gone away.
No.
But neither is Rob's presence, which...
Exactly.
Yeah. If that's the trade-off you've got to make, then it's not so bad.
No, exactly.
It's obviously horrible, but at least we've still got something of Rob still here.
Exactly. And it's something that absolutely emulates Rob, which is a film festival. It's amazing. Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share with those who are listening?
Wow. Final thoughts. Yeah, I think something that really stayed with Aaron and I when we were making the film was that there was this sense when we started it that we thought we were making one film. And then as we went through it, things sort of changed and it became something else entirely. And I think through speaking to people about the topic of knife violence and, youth violence and how people get to that place, we discovered that there's no one cause, there's no one pathway, there's no one fix-all. And ultimately, what we found through making this documentary is that we all need to think about ourselves and about each other and notice things and work together as a community, as a global community, as a national community, as a local community, to keep ourselves safe. It's way more fundamental than just stop the knives. And I think, if I'm going to leave one final thought, it would be just consider those around you, because anyone could be next.
I think that is an important point to end on. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. And everyone needs to check out this documentary for sure. Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Because this episode ended up being so long, I've had to split it into 2 parts. So please go and listen to part 2 now, where I interview the documentary's director, Aaron Truss, and Rob Knox's dad, Colin.